guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Cruel Intentions, a true crime channel. I am Holly, and with every video I take you on a journey throughout Australian true crime history. If you are interested in Australian true crime and you don't mind me taking a couple of weeks off, then please consider subscribing, or don't. I'm not here to tell you what to do, I'm not your real mum, and I never will be. So I suppose I owe you guys an apology and an explanation. I am very sorry for being MIA for the last couple of weeks, but there is a very good reason for it. I am actually getting married in a couple of weeks' time. So I have been very busy and my attention has been set on planning and organising and the last few bits and pieces and details for that. So after the next couple of weeks, we will definitely go back to regular scheduled programming. So thank you guys so much for being so patient. So today, we're actually going to go way back to the early 1800s, and we're going to talk about Australia's first ever convicted cannibal. He went by the name of Alexander Pearce, and he was a convict sent from Ireland to the harshest penal colony in Australia. Now, Alexander Pearce was born in 1790 in County Monaghan in Ireland. Very little is known about Pearce's childhood. His parents are completely unknown. It was reported that he never married or had any children, but the country at that time would not have been an easy place to grow up in. His county, County Monaghan, was a poor, impoverished farming town. It was overrun with poverty and sicknesses like smallpox. Pearce actually suffered with smallpox as a child, but he ended up making a living by becoming a farm labourer 45 minutes away in County Fermanagh. Farming was the predominant industry at the time in those counties. It had almost triple the amount of farm labourers than any other part of the country at that time. In 1819, Pearce was caught stealing 6 pairs of shoes. He was 5'3", brown-haired, hazel-eyed, and he was 29 years old, and his face was covered in pockmarks as a result of the smallpox that he contracted as a child. So due to his shorter height and distinct appearance, he was noticeable to the authorities and was apprehended really quickly. He was taken to a neighbouring county called Armagh, and he was convicted of theft of boots, which was quite a common conviction, and he was sentenced to 7 years transportation. So transportation, if you are not an Australian and didn't sit through hours and hours of history class on the convicts and prison colonies, was the sentence of relocating convicted criminals as punishment to generally remote or undesirable places, creating penal colonies. In the times of ancient Rome, it would have been called banishment or exile, with the main difference being that transportation allowed governments to establish new colonies in other parts of the world and create economically viable pockets all over the globe for British colonisers. Now, originally the British Empire would send their convicts to its overseas colonies in the Americas, but the American Revolution caused a suspension by enacting the Criminal Law Act of 1776. Mass-scale transport from Britain resumed in 1787, with the first fleet being sent to Australia, and the practice continued in the British Empire until 1868. Alexander Pearce was sent aboard the Castle Forbes, and with its criminal cargo was sent to Van Diemen's Land. Now, Van Diemen's Land was the name given to Tasmania by the Europeans, due to Abel Tasman, who was the first European to land in Tasmania, and he named it after Anthony Van Diemen, who was the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, the company that had sent Abel Tasman on that voyage. Now, it was renamed to Tasmania in 1856 to try to disassociate it with its criminal past and the demon connotation, whilst also continuing to pay tribute to Abel Tasman. The Castle Forbes left Ireland on the 3rd of October 1819 with about 30 other convict passengers on board. Now, for the next 5 months, the ship sailed to Australia while the prisoners endured confinement below deck. They routinely suffered from hunger and thirst and sicknesses like dysentery and scurvy. They were kept in very, very small quarters, and they generally weren't allowed above deck for fresh air. The ship finally landed on Tasmanian shores on the 4th of March 1820. Now, Peirce was one of over 73,000 that was sent to Tasmania, which made up about 40% of all convicts sent to Australia between 1800 and the abolition of transportation in 1853. Now, if you've ever seen a map of Australia, you'll understand why that is so crazy. Tasmania is number one of the smallest states that we have, but it's a tiny little island compared with the mainland of Australia. So if you consider that almost half of convicts that were sent to Australia were sent to that one tiny island in the south. Now, although Alexander Pearce was sentenced to 7 years, after serving part of his sentence, he would actually be eligible to apply for a ticket of leave, allowing some freedoms like marrying and raising a family, seeking employment, and being able to travel within the district. It was basically the earliest form of parole. Now, after 7 years, or even earlier, if he had observed the conditions of his ticket of leave, Peirce would be able to go back to Ireland, as long as he could pay his own way home. But Alexander Pearce would never make it back to Ireland. He would never serve his full sentence, and he would never leave Australia again. Peirce very quickly established himself as a difficult prisoner, and he had a varied list of offences and punishments recorded. In May of 1821, he embezzled 2 turkeys and 3 ducks, which got him 50 lashes and yard gang for 14 days. In September of the same year, he was charged with drunken disorderly and absent from lodgings at watch, which got him 25 lashes. In November that year, drunken disorderly and stealing a wine glass, which got him 50 lashes. November, stealing a wheelbarrow, which got him 50 lashes and 6 months' labour on the jail or chain gang, which would add up to 10 pounds or around 4.5 kilos to each of his leg irons, and he would be chained to other convicts while they worked. Now, for a while after that, Peirce went quiet, and about 4 months went by with no recorded offences until March of 1822, when he escaped from the penal colony in Hobart and ran into the woods. Now, he managed to evade capture for almost 2 months. But in the meantime, the Hobart Town Gazette advertised Peirce as an absconder and put a £10 reward on his capture, and in May of that year, he was caught. On the 6th of July 1822, Peirce was charged with the absconding or escaping of the penal colony, as well as forging orders under the name of Thomas Williams and R.W. Fryault, with the intent to defraud. Now, forging orders means that he had forged money orders in order to allow him to have some walking around money while he was on the run from the authorities. Now, the penalty for this crime was actually a second sentence of transportation, and he was sent to a secondary penal establishment on Sarah Island in Macquarie Harbour. Now, the mouth of this harbour was affectionately named Hell's Gate, and the penal colony there quickly developed the reputation of being hell on earth. Now, this was in part because of Alexander Pearce, but also due to being considered to house the worst of the worst. The inhabitants were generally those who had reoffended or couldn't be controlled in other settlements. It was basically a place of banishment. Now, the name also came from the perils of even getting there. Tidal currents and shallow shores resulted in many deaths of convicts in shipwrecks before they even reached land, and for that reason it was actually considered almost impossible to escape from. They even used a smaller island off the northeast coast called Grommet Island for solitary confinement. The aim of the settlement was to make it economically viable, which would be able to reimburse the costs that the British government had expended creating the colony. Now, this was done by logging the island of the Huon pine, which is a native Tasmanian conifer, so it was a valuable resource. But what they failed to realise is that by clearing the land, they had exposed the settlement to the high winds and gales and created an even worse environment for both the convicts and the officers. The convicts spent their waking hours logging trees and preparing them to be rafted down the river, so they spent hours upon hours up to their necks in water. Punishment was given swiftly and often, and it was reported that even looking at a guard or officer wrong could land you with a punishment of lashings. But it wasn't the guards or the officers that administered the punishment. Other convicts were forced to give the guilty party their lashes, and if it was deemed that they had not been given with enough severity, they would also be punished. To maximise the damage that would be inflicted on the inmates, the whips at Sarah Island would have tin shards twisted into them. It was one of the most isolated and remote prisons in one of the most isolated and inhospitable islands in the world. It was designed to break men, not to rehabilitate them, to process them into model citizens who could take orders and work for the good of the British Empire. The punishments, more than a few times, were so severe that the convict being lashed would actually die from the wounds. Eventually, there was an allowance for a doctor to intervene if they thought the prisoner was in danger of death. The lashings would stop, and the convict would be given time to recover, only until they'd recovered enough so that the punishment could resume. Sarah Island was bleak, and due to supplies only being able to be delivered by sea and not produced on the island, sicknesses like malnutrition, dysentery, and scurvy ran rampant throughout the settlement. Living conditions got worse when it came to sleeping, and the colony was so overcrowded that prisoners were actually unable to sleep on their backs and had to sleep on their sides to fit within the quarters that they were provided. Now, later, after all of this, in 1824, a prisoner by the name of Trenham actually stabbed another convict to ensure that he was executed instead of having to live any longer in the Macquarie Harbour penal colony. Now, as it turned out, the trees that the convicts had been cutting down, the Huon pine, was perfect for shipbuilding, as that wood produces a natural oil that resists rot, which is perfect for something that's going to sit in water, well, forever. Now, a Scotsman heard of this amazing natural Tasmanian wood, and he voluntarily visited the island. In return for the convicts' cooperation in his venture, he traded things like rum, tobacco, and better sleeping quarters. So Macquarie Harbour, for a time, was actually one of the most successful shipyards in Australia. New convicts would be made to complete hard labour in timber hauling and logging, and basically, if they behaved themselves and stayed in line, they would be promoted to other positions like servicemen, signalmen, boat crew, or moved into the lumber or shipyard. Now, there have only been a handful of people to ever have escaped Sarah Island. I want to detour here just to tell you about one of the escapes because I think it's awesome. This escape in particular is called the Frederick Escape, in which 10 convicts, led by former whaler James Porter, were actually permitted to remain behind after the eventual closure of the settlement to complete the building of a brig or ship called the Frederick. Now, these prisoners in particular were left with a skeleton crew of guards, but they very quickly overpowered them, left them on shore, and then literally stole the ship that they'd just finished building. They then sailed the Frederick across the South Pacific Sea for 40 days, later landing on the shore of the Bueno River in Chile, where they were actually able to pass themselves off as survivors of a different shipwreck. Although the Chilean government were suspicious, nothing came of it. That is until the governor was replaced and his successor alerted a passing frigate, and 4 of the escapees were sent back to Australia to face trial for piracy. But the prisoners argued that since the ship was not yet officially launched when they hijacked it, and that it was stolen from a harbour and not the high seas, that it can't be considered piracy. Now, did you know that that was a prerequisite to piracy? Because I did not. They said, quote, "It was canvas, rope, boarding, and nails, put together, shipwise, yet it was not a legal ship. The seizure might have been theft, but it was not piracy." They were eventually convicted of piracy, but instead of being sentenced to death, they were sentenced back to prison and sent to other penal colonies. Now, Porter actually saved a couple of guards during a capsize, and so he was sent on to Newcastle to serve his remaining time, which had been reduced. But in 1847, he escaped again, successfully, and was never again heard from. Anyway, back to Alexander Pearce. Now, less than 2 months after he was sent to Hell's Gate, Peirce, along with 7 other convicts, Alexander Dalton, Thomas Boddingham, William Kennelly, Matthew Travers, Edward Brown, Robert Greenhill, and John Mather, escaped the penal colony. Now, most reports say that while they were working on the eastern side of the harbour, they had hatched a plan to commandeer a nearby whaleboat and sail to freedom to a Pacific island or China or anywhere but where they were. They easily overpowered their guard, but they were unable to get the boat, so they did the only thing they could, and they ran straight into the Australian bush and mountains that surrounded the harbour. Now, Bob Greenhill had nominated himself as the leader because he'd previously been a sailor and had also brought with him an axe. So he not only had the skills of navigation, but he also had the only means of protection, defence and attack. It was actually Greenhill and Travers that had come up with the escape plan, so they took the lead, set up all the details and led the other men into the bush. The Australian outback has always been considered some of the world's toughest terrain to survive in, and without the experience and right equipment, it is difficult to imagine being able to survive for any length of time without proper supplies. Now, these men walked for 8 days straight in hellish terrain, exhausted, starving, not to mention that they weren't receiving the proper nutrition to begin with, and they were all in the extreme stages of dehydration. They had carried some bread with them, enough for a few days, but they actually weren't aware that the bread they'd been eating was baked with a bacterium called ergot, which accelerates rot in the bread, and it's also a known hallucinogen. The men not only started to develop mild hallucinations, but also hypothermia from the freezing cold nights. They slowly came to realize after almost 2 weeks with no food and no shelter that the only chance of survival would be to sacrifice one of the group to feed the others. Bob Greenhill had spoken of his time in the Navy and how he had heard stories of cannibalism. After days of hunger, thirst, and hallucinations, the group agreed that they would need to decide on who would be the sacrifice. Travers had actually been a butcher in his previous life before he was a criminal, so he knew exactly what to do with the meat once they had it. But the big decision, of course, was going to be who ended up being the first victim. But Peirce, in a later confession, would actually say that the first unfortunate victim was Alexander Dalton. And the reason that they had chosen Dalton is because he had previously volunteered to be a flogger for the overseers and officers in the colony. So he had actually put his hand up to say he wanted to deliver lashings to other prisoners. So he was hated by a lot of them. Some of the group, including Dalton, had fallen behind due to exhaustion, and all 8 of the men were becoming weak from hunger. In some reports, Dalton was sleeping, and in others his back was turned, when one of the other men attacked him with the axe, striking several strong blows, killing him. Travers, who again had been a butcher before his transportation sentence, carefully divided the body of Alexander Dalton between himself and his companions, and they ate him after cooking his flesh over a campfire. They had cooked and packed a large amount of Alexander Dalton's body to continue to eat while they traversed through the bush, and the next day the group set out again. They were full but still exhausted, but anything was better than going back to Sarah Island. Well, not as it turned out for Kennelly and Brown. They feared that they would be the next victims, and not at all wanting to be killed and eaten by their friends, they fled back to the colony. Now, keep in mind they'd been walking for almost 9 days with no food, no water, and no shelter. But these two men actually made it back. Now, they had spent almost 3 weeks having eaten nothing but the body of another one of the convicts, but they both made it back to the colony. Unfortunately, both of them very shortly after passed away from exhaustion. The remaining 5 men continued. Greenhill used the sun, stars, and his sailing training to navigate due east and actually led the rest of the party through the bush for 42 days towards some of the settled areas and freedom, which was extraordinary considering the lack of food, water, and shelter. What the group failed to realise, though, is that due to the lack of carbohydrates in the meat that they were eating, which was Alexander Dalton, they weren't getting enough energy for what they were expending every day. As they continued through the harsh bushland and thick forest, they became even more malnourished and weak, and knew that the time had come for another decision to be made. Now, Alexander Pearce actually gave a couple of confessions to this adventure. He said that they began to draw straws to see who would be their next meal for the rest of the party. He said that at this point it was Bodenham that drew the short straw. He didn't go into too much detail as to how the arrangement worked, whether Bodenham knew that he was going to be food for the evening, and whether he stood there and just let them come at him with the axe, or whether they waited till his back was turned, or whether he was asleep. What we do know is that Bodenham was killed, and he was butchered by Travers, and he was cooked over the campfire for the rest of the group to eat. The lack of proper nutrients, though, still had not changed. The group still wasn't getting enough carbohydrates to sustain them for their journey. It wasn't long before Mather joined Bodenham as a victim as dinner for his companions. But at this point, Greenhill, Travers, and Peirce were so hungry and were so dehydrated that they had stopped cooking the meat of their companions. They would leave Travers to butcher the bodies, as he had the expertise, and they would simply eat their friends raw. Now, according to Peirce, he himself hadn't actually done any of the killing. It had been Greenhill mostly with the first blows of the axe to kill the men, and then Travers would use his butcher's expertise on the victim's body. They began carrying as much of the meat as they could to eat on the way. Now, there were only 3 of them left at this point, and Peirce knew that he was in danger. Greenhill and Travers had been working together from the beginning, and he knew that if he didn't do something, he would be next. Now, it was at this point that Peirce ran into, well, I guess you could say, a little bit of luck. As they were walking, Travers was bitten on the foot by a tiger snake. Now, you know how they say that everything lives in Australia is basically trying to kill you? Well, this was no exception. Tiger snakes come in many different colours, but are generally distinguishable by the tiger-like stripes or bands around the body. They are highly venomous, and if not treated, they caused localised pain in the foot and neck, tingling, numbness, and sweating, and then the bad bit starts, with breathing difficulties and paralysis, and eventually death in most cases. Now, Greenhill somehow managed to convince Peirce to help him carry his friend for the remainder of the journey, half carrying and half dragging Travers, who was unable to support himself and whose wound had become gangrenous. After 5 days of this, Travers was in so much agony that he was reported to have begged the others to kill him and put him out of his misery. So that night, while he slept, the pair killed him with the axe and used their last remaining companion for the sustenance that they would need to continue their journey. Now, for the next 8 days, Greenhill and Peirce played a dangerous game of cat and mouse, neither willing to allow themselves to sleep for fear that the other would grab the axe and attack. They both desperately tried to stay awake for as long as they could, but after days of sleep deprivation, more exhaustion, and more hunger, Greenhill finally fell asleep. That allowed Peirce to get a hold of the axe, and while Greenhill slept, he snuck up behind him and he attacked him. He hacked him over the head with the axe multiple times until Greenhill was dead. Then, as was the custom, he began to dismember the body. He consumed some of Greenhill's body there where he'd killed him and packed as much as he could carry to continue his journey out of the wilderness. He didn't know how much longer he would be on the run and needed to carry as much as he could because now he had no other companions for food. Now, as his provisions ran down, he continued his long and difficult trek, and at some point after weeks of battling through the Australian bush, Peirce began seeing sheep, and he eventually came upon a flock. Now, he knew that they were farmed by other penal colonies, so he must be coming towards some sort of settlement. He came upon a convict shepherd and befriended him for long enough to get some rest, food, and water, and build up enough strength to join a local sheep stealing and smuggling ring. At this point, he was living in caves, sneaking into the settlement with a couple of other bushrangers at night for food and supplies. But these other bushrangers that he was with were also wanted by the authorities, and so the group was eventually caught, and Peirce's grand escape was finally at an end. Now, Peirce had spent a total of 113 days on the run, more than half of it in the bush wilderness, and then he was taken back to Hobart Jail to be processed, and he was eventually transported back to Hell's Gate. Well, amazingly, Alexander Pearce actually confessed everything to the magistrate/chaplain, Reverend Robert Notwood. All the gory details of his travels, including all the details about the murders and cannibalism. Although Peirce only actually admitted to killing Greenhill, claiming that Greenhill and Travers had been the ones to do all of the killing until it was only the two of them. But he did admit to eating parts of every other person with him. Now, the magistrate listened intently to Peirce's story, and when he'd finished, he assumed that Peirce was making up every single part of the gruesome story to cover for the other prisoners who were most likely still on the run. Notwood thought Peirce a thief and an absconder, but had never considered that he might be a monster, so he assumed that the rest of the escapees were making their way through Tasmania as bushrangers or as members of outlaw gangs. Peirce was sent back to Sarah Island in chains, and he was celebrated by the other convicts, who treated him as a hero and revered him when he returned. Now, the overseers at the colony decided that the only way to handle this would be to make an example of Peirce. They lumped punishment on top of punishment, regular beatings, lashes, and even being chained to a beam for days at a time on Grommet Island, the small rocky outcrop off the coast, where the overseers would travel daily to provide a few drops of water so that Peirce could survive to live through his solitary confinement. Peirce would be expected to serve the remainder of his sentence in this manner, for what the magistrate believed to only be an escape and evasion of capture. It's said that Peirce had hoped to be executed in confessing the crimes, which would have been the sentence given for the crime of such a horrific nature, but as they believed the story to be false, he instead would suffer for the rest of his sentence. So this should be where the story ends, right? He pretty much got sent back to the prison camp with a bunch of additional punishment. He was lucky to escape a death penalty for the atrocious murders and cannibalism that he'd committed in almost 4 months that he was on the run. But that was not the end for Alexander Peirce. Within a year of returning, he had planned another escape, encouraged and supported by a young convict named Thomas Cox. Cox had reportedly been bugging Peirce to let him join in on an escape attempt until Peirce had finally given in. The report states that Peirce and Cox escaped into the woods whilst on a work party, each of them taking the axe they carried with them and both still wearing heavy iron chains. they escaped heading north along the east coast of the island. For several days the pair wandered north, weakening each step of the way, and with no other provisions than the axes they had, dragging the heavy iron chains they had been shackled with. When they came across King's River, Peirce discovered that Cox couldn't swim, which would make it almost impossible to get across, as Peirce could not carry Cox with the weight of both men and the chains. Now, the fact that Thomas Cox couldn't swim had apparently made Peirce so mad, and he was so hungry, that in a violent hunger-fueled rage he attacked Cox. They fought on the bank of the river, and Peirce ended the fight by landing 3 blows from his axe upon Thomas Cox's head. Now, somehow in this struggle, Peirce's chains had been knocked off, and he started to walk away. Now, Thomas Cox was still alive. He was breathing, and upon noticing that Peirce was leaving, he called out faintly, quote, "For mercy's sake, come back and put me out of my misery." Peirce then struck a 4th blow with his axe in the head, killing Thomas Cox. Peirce would later tell the commanding officer, Thomas Smith, that he removed a piece of Cox's thigh, roasted it, and ate it there on the bank of the river next to Cox's dead body. He then removed another piece of flesh, which he kept secure in his pocket, before swimming across the river, hoping to reach Port Dalrymple on the north coast of Tasmania. It was then said that Peirce was so overwhelmed by guilt and remorse and horror at what he had again done that he swam back across the river, built a signal fire, lit it when he noticed a schooner leaving a settlement, and flagged the ship down. Peirce then convinced the captain to launch the pilot boat and pick him up in the river. He was taken back to the harbour for the 3rd time, where he voluntarily admitted to the murder and stated that he was willing to die for the crime. Thomas Smith testified for the Attorney General and the prosecution and said that, quote, "Peirce said that Cox had died and that he had cut off a bit of his flesh to show what had become of him." Smith then went on to say that he had been directed by the Commandant to go with the prisoner to find the body of Thomas Cox. And here is where some doubts about Peirce's story come up. When the body was found, the brutality of the attack had been completely understated in Peirce's retelling. When Smith escorted Peirce to find the body, Thomas Cox's body was found without its head or hands. The bowels had been removed, the greater part of the thighs and buttocks gone, as well as the calves and the fleshy parts of the arms. Peirce's story about removing and roasting a small piece of Cox was a far cry from the mutilated and gruesome body that was eventually found. Smith asked Peirce, quote, "How could you do such a deed as this?" And the reply from Peirce was, "No person can tell what he will do when driven by hunger." But the part about this that makes it even more strange is that Peirce was actually found with food on his person. In his pockets, officers found bread and cheese. This means that consuming his companion was never necessary. But perhaps it was something that Peirce had, excuse the pun, developed a taste for, which he was reported to have admitted later on, and this may also explain his sudden change of heart after he'd crossed the river. He may have killed Cox in a rage and then was compelled to repeat his previous cannibalistic tendencies. When he was asked about the location of Cox's head, Peirce told Smith that he had left it with the body, and after a short search, it was found just a few yards away. This search also revealed the removed liver of the victim and one of the axes the men had taken with them. Peirce confirmed that that was the same axe he'd used to kill Thomas Cox. Smith went on to find the signal fire that Peirce had built and a small knife near the body. The evidence was collected and the body was placed into 2 rugs and returned to the settlement. Peirce was then questioned about the discrepancies between his original story and the evidence at the actual crime scene. When asked where Cox's hands were, he said that he had left them on a tree where the boat had landed. A search was made to try and recover them, but they were never found. Peirce then told Smith that he had removed so much of Cox's body to support him on the journey that he'd planned to Port Dalrymple, but when he'd crossed the river, something had suddenly come over him, which made him return. He said that he'd thrown the rest of the parts of the body into the river, all but one, which he'd put in his pocket to take back as proof of his crime. After all, he'd been the party to murder and cannibalism of 7 other men, and solely responsible for at least one of them, and no one had believed him. He had then made the signal fire and given himself up. He was tried in the Supreme Court of Van Diemen's Land in Hobart on a cold winter's day in June of 1824, with notoriously scrupulous Judge John Lewis Petter, and in front of a jury, the prosecution laid out all of the grisly details. Alexander Pearce was reported to have shown real remorse throughout the trial, which also lends to his sudden change of heart after his attack on Thomas Cox. He had no defense counsel, and there is no record of him saying anything on his behalf. The trial and deliberation was brief. Some reports have it at less than 30 minutes before the verdict came back. On June the 20th, 1824, Alexander Pearce was found guilty of the murder and cannibalism of Thomas Cox. The Chief Justice swiftly handed down the sentence of death by hanging, with the addendum that his body was to be donated to surgeons for dissection, the common 19th century thinking being that murderers, and particularly cannibals, should be studied to find out anomalies in their body chemistry. Alexander Pearce met with Father Philip Connolly while he awaited his death to receive his last rites and sacraments. Father Connolly, whilst performing his duties, heard the last confession of Alexander Pearce, where Pearce told him everything. He laid out in exact detail what had happened on both escape attempts, the horrific crimes he had committed, and the reason why. It was this confession that was the basis for the film The Last Confession of Alexander Pearce, made in 2008, written by Neil Fulton and directed by Michael J. Rowland, an Australian-Irish film that depicts the events that transpired when Pearce traversed the Australian wilderness. On the 19th of July, 1824, 30 days after his sentence was handed down, and in the yard of the Hobart Town Jail, Pearce was hung by the neck until he was dead. It's reported that he said shortly before he was hung that man's flesh is delicious. It tastes far better than fish or pork. Now, while Alexander Pearce was sent to Sarah Island as a convict and a thief, the constant abuse, torture, beating, lashes, flogging, as well as the hunger, thirst, sickness, and disease made him, or at least I believe had a large contribution in making him the monster that he is remembered as. There was no hope, no redemption, and no escape from the torturous punishments or from being forced to administer them to your fellow prisoners. Now, after he was dead, Pearce's skull actually ended up in the US as part of anthropologist Dr. Samuel Morton's collection, who was of the opinion that cranial capacity determined intellectual ability, which it doesn't. In 1968, the skull ended up at the University of Pennsylvania, and it remains there until this day. And that, my friends, is the story of Australia's first ever convicted cannibal, Alexander Pearce. Thank you so much for your patience on me getting this episode out. I'm very excited about my wedding, and hopefully shortly after that I will have the next video for you. So I hope to see you guys in the next episode. But until then, be good, be safe, and don't murder anyone. And definitely don't eat 8 different people. That's also very bad. Bye.